example. But there are so many others. So in 2020, you heard about the SolarWinds attack, which was very frightening because it targeted multiple US government departments, including the DHS. It was a massive breach. And it managed to exfiltrate and steal emails of Secretary of DHS, and also emails of officials who are responsible for identifying foreign threats. So this was a very frightening attack because it had implications on our national security. Then recently in 2021, you've also likely heard about the huge breach to the Microsoft Exchange server, where they managed to compromise Exchange servers on the premise of organizations using the service, and that provided full access to emails and passwords. In fact, what was particularly worrisome is that the attackers got access to administrative privileges on the server. And the moment you get access to administrative account, you get access to a lot of privilege within that system, because administrators are very privileged users. In fact, often the most privileged users can install software, can steal or download data and whatnot. So you become very, very powerful once an attacker can get hold of an administrator's account. So these attackers managed to exfiltrate data from more than 250,000 servers over more than 30,000 organizations, which is massive. So when looking at these attacks and just looking at just news that constantly tell us about more and more attacks happening, larger and larger scale, the question is, why do they keep happening? Why are we not stopping them? And the reason is that the existing mechanisms for security deployed are fundamentally weak. They are fundamentally insufficient. Why? Because of the following reason. Take a cloud. The way the cloud could be an external cloud, or could be even within the premise, a cluster of servers within the premise, a private cloud. The way the sensitive user data is protected today is through many different techniques, but they essentially embody perimeter defense. So that means that the servers are building taller and taller walls around this data to protect the attacker from breaking in. Now, these walls are made of software. Software is complex, software has bugs. It will always have bugs. There's no way for us to construct software, design software that doesn't have bugs. It will always have bugs. And that's when attackers exploit those bugs and get access to the data. Okay, and the reason it's a fundamental weakness is that there will always be software bugs. So attackers will always be able to exploit them and get access to the data. It's not a question of whether this software can be broken into or not. It will be broken into. It's just a question of when. And exactly this kind of software bugs is what was the basis of the Microsoft Exchange server and the SolarWinds attack. And these kind of walls can be many things. They can be firewalls, they can be access control protection enforced by the operating system or by the application. It doesn't really matter. If it's software, it's going to have software bugs and exploits. So instead, we in academia, and actually, as Sanjeev mentioned in my PhD thesis 6 years ago, I was trying to really put forth the idea that we should be prepared for an attack. We should assume attacks will happen. They're granted, they will happen. But be prepared even then. So even when the attacker broke in, has access to everything on your server, even then have some protection, confine the attacker's behavior, what they can see, what they can destroy, and so forth. Okay, so assume the attacker will break in and be prepared even then. And it's really exciting to see that even the NSA has taken over this concept recently into the notion of zero trust. So basically in their release in February earlier this year, they recognized the fact that traditional perimeter-based network defenses have proven themselves insufficient. And basically they promote the so-called zero trust model, in which you should assume that the breach is unavoidable, or has already occurred, and make sure that you're still protected even then. So ideally, you don't want to trust any one system component with the security of the whole data. So it shouldn't be that if one server gets compromised, the attacker gets all the data on the system. It shouldn't be that if an administrator account gets compromised, the attacker gets access to all the data in the system. There should not be any such node or service. Every node, service, or account should only have access to a small amount of data. It should be confined in its access. And NSA is strongly recommending that the zero trust security model is considered for all critical networks, including defense industrial base critical networks. And then later this year, they also had an executive order on pushing to adopt zero trust and advance towards zero trust in an accelerated manner. So besides the government, zero trust has already been recognized to be very important in industry. And there's a number of tools out there that I'm sure you heard about, but didn't necessarily think of them as zero trust, but they are embodying the zero trust principle in a number of ways. So for example, blockchain and cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and many others, the basic principle is that you shouldn't trust a bank or a government or a central entity to manage the transactions, but it should be done in a distributed trust manner. So even if some users are compromised, they would like to double spend, would like to cheat in some way, they're prevented by the cryptographic protocol. So even when some attackers and users are compromised, you're protected. There isn't any one service or node that just that one alone can affect the security of Bitcoin or Ethereum. Okay, so that's essentially zero trust at work. Now, even more exciting is the fact that now the masses, most of us, are using end-to-end encrypted chat like WhatsApp and Signal. And end-to-end encryption is a form of zero trust, because what happens is that on your local device, you encrypt the message for your friend, and then you send it encrypted over the network to the server, to the WhatsApp server, for example. And then the WhatsApp server sends it to the destination, to your friend, and only your friend can decrypt. The reason this is zero trust is that the WhatsApp server only sees encrypted data. So if the attacker breaks in, they're prepared. The attacker breaks into the WhatsApp server, the data is encrypted. They can't read user messages. So they're prepared even then. And similarly for Signal. And in this past few years with the pandemic and with teleworking, even Zoom adopted end-to-end encryption. So a lot of the video communications today in Zoom are end-to-end encrypted. So similarly, if an attacker breaks into the server at Zoom, they can only see encrypted videos for those communications that use end-to-end encryption. But even though these are super exciting advances, they still merely just scratch the surface of bringing zero trust to industry at wide. And the reason is that besides chat and blockchain, we also have a bunch of other communication and collaboration systems like file storage and sharing systems, right? Email and so many other tools that you're using, and many systems and applications that you have deployed and using. So the question is, how do we bring zero trust to those as well? And to think about bringing zero trust to those systems, you have to think about the core components they have, and then for each one of them, what to do. And so the main components in a system are servers, users, and there's a special type of users, the administrators. So now I'm going to go over a set of principles to achieve zero trust for each one of these entities. And these are principles that we in academia back and strongly believe to be conceptually very, very helpful in providing and going the direction of zero trust. So let me begin by taking the example of a mail server. If we look at traditional mail servers without zero trust, for example, GCC High, Office 365, G Suite, what happens is that the server, you have these mail servers, and these mail servers can see the email in an encrypted form. So when you have a user send mail, this mail to destination users, the mail servers are going to see unencrypted emails. So for example, company A here sees the emails that its employees are sending and stores that many times, and also stores emails that it receives. So now if an attacker goes after company A's mail server, which happened in the case of the exchange servers, the attacker is going to be able to see all this wealth of sensitive emails. So in contrast, end-to-end encryption is, as I already alluded to briefly, is a super powerful mechanism for providing zero trust. So with end-to-end encryption, the email is encrypted on the user's device and sent encrypted outside of the device and stays encrypted throughout the whole time until it reaches the destination where it gets decrypted. Okay, just like in this animation, encrypt, send encrypted, stays encrypted throughout the server, gets encrypted to the destination where it gets decrypted. That's why it's called end-to-end, because only the ends can see the email. Only the ends, no intermediaries. So let's say you have your mail server in the AWS GovCloud. It's only going to get encrypted email. So even when the attacker breaks in, you are prepared, because if the attacker looks at the emails, steals them, they're encrypted. They cannot read their content. So it's a very, very, very powerful technique in the direction of zero trust. And not surprisingly, when all this telework started, becoming even more widespread with the pandemic, the NSA put out some guidelines on the kind of tools one should use for communication and collaboration. And the very first question they were asking is, make sure that your service implements end-to-end encryption, because end-to-end encryption is so effective at protecting your communication traffic. All right, so that was one. Now let's look a little bit at the users. Well, the users use passwords to authenticate into the system. So if you have an attacker that can guess a certain password, they can authenticate as the user. Now, the problem we know is that users choose weak passwords because they want to remember them. So it's actually quite easy to brute force a lot of the users use. Some users use good ones, it's hard to brute force, but the vast majority of users use very simple passwords like job, work, God, 1, 2, 3, and whatnot. And those are very, very simple to brute force by an attacker and guess by trying multiple times and then log in as that user. So instead, another principle that helps a lot in the direction of zero trust is to use cryptographic keys instead of passwords. Avoid using passwords if you can and use cryptographic keys. Cryptographic keys are going to be on your device. They are much bigger. They have a ton of entropy, a ton of random bits. They're generated by the machine. They're not memorable, but they have so much entropy that they are unguessable by an attacker. In fact, there are more such keys, possible keys, than there are atoms in the universe. So it's infeasible for an attacker to try different keys, try all of them until they find your key. Okay. So then if you have a key like this on your device and use that key to decrypt the data on the server, the attacker from another device, they can't just try to guess different keys and decrypt the data. Okay, so cryptographic keys are much, much more powerful than passwords. So now let's turn our attention to the third element I mentioned, which is the administrator. Administrators, as you know, are very, very powerful. They can read a lot of the data in the system, export it. They can reset the passwords of the users. They can delete users. They're very, very powerful. That's why they're often central points of attack. We saw in the case of the Microsoft Exchange server attacks, that the attacker got access to administrative accounts. When that happens, the attacker can do so much damage because essentially the administrators are a place where zero trust is violated. They are a central point of attack, a point where if the attacker attacks a single node, there's a lot of leakage and a big breach that can happen. So that's why when providing a zero trust solution, it's important to think about some way to distribute the trust across multiple administrators, right? So you don't want to have an administrator that's so powerful that even though it's fully well intended, the account can still get compromised. Okay, so instead what you want to do is you want to try to distribute the trust. And there's many different ways we have to distribute trust in academia, and I won't go into the details of them, but intuitively, what you do is that you could have a group of administrators, let's say 3 or 4, whatever many you want, and each one of them just have a piece of keys. So for example, let's say we want to be able to reset Alice's key in case she loses it, or give her back access to her files in case she loses it. Then we're going to have, let's say, 3 administrators, they each have a piece of Alice's key. Now, when Alice loses her key, they can come together, reconstruct her key, and then Alice gets back access to her encrypted files. Now, any one of these administrators alone is not a central point of attack, because if the attacker goes after them, they can only get a piece of the key. And that piece of the key is not going to reveal the whole key. You need all the administrators, or you need at least a threshold of them to be able to reconstruct the key. And this is guaranteed by the mathematics underlying the distributed trust that I won't go into. Okay, but the idea is that you really want to think hard about how you distribute the trust among a group of administrators so that none of them is a central point of attack. And as a final technique towards zero trust is to think about how to confine your community. So if your organization and your collaborators and your network is so open that attackers can just send emails, they're going to send phishing emails. And phishing is really hard because you can get an email that's spear phishing, which is super targeted to you. And it looks so legitimate. It looks from people you know, context you know, and it triggers many times users to take actions they shouldn't have, like transferring money somewhere, sending documents somewhere else. Okay, so phishing still, especially spear phishing, is still very effective. So instead, you want to have communities of zero trust. So in these communities, what you do is you can enforce through some cryptographic mechanisms I won't go into, a verification of, okay, am I getting this email from the supplier organization, or am I getting this email from somebody who claims to be the supplier organization? Okay, so something like trusted communities, you can really, if the attacker sends an email, you can really check it's not them because they're not able to produce some cryptographic information that a legitimate organization could. And that's a hugely effective defense against phishing attacks. Okay, so far I told you about a number of techniques that we consider to be very, very effective in the direction of providing zero trust. At PreVeil, we took this from the academic space and we really tried to think of ways to make this very, very easy to use. So PreVeil provides a zero trust email and file sharing system. And a lot of the technical novelty has been in making it super easy to use. It integrates with common file systems and email clients. It looks like Dropbox looks like, files in your file system, emails in your regular mail client. That's where a ton of the innovation comes into play, because we all know that when you add encryption and security, things could become much harder to use. But with these mechanisms, you can actually use things in very much the same way that you use original systems while having the zero trust mechanisms. So as my last slide, these are basically the trust mechanisms that we are implementing in PreVeil. It's the principle of end-to-end encryption for email and file sharing. Then we distribute the trust in a cryptographic way through Shamir secret sharing via a notion we call approval groups. We don't rely on any additionally new passwords. We don't add any new passwords, but we use cryptographic keys instead. And finally, we implement trusted communities through a series of cryptographic mechanisms like digital signatures, verifiable identities, and whatnot. And importantly, these 4 things are delivered in a way that's easy to use and has all this enterprise integration of various features that enterprises need and tools and ease of monitoring, logging, and whatnot. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up and just basically summarize and say that zero trust is important to prevent attackers from breaking into one specific node. It's important to be prepared when attackers break into any one server, because with perimeter-based defenses, we saw attackers will break in, and there's at least 4 principles that you can implement that are super effective going in the direction of zero trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raluca, for that overview. I'm going to start off by asking some basic questions that often come up. The first is that virtually the entire community has grown up prior to hearing about zero trust and thinking of it almost as a buzzword. Oh, gee, here's another new one. With the perimeter-based approach, and specifically thinking about security for communication systems as, oh, I have encryption in transit and I have encryption in rest. So a practitioner often thinks, look, the file or email is going encrypted in transit, and then I am told that the information is also stored encrypted at rest. To me, that seems like a very good security system, because you said encryption is powerful. It's encrypted in transit, it's encrypted in rest. Why is it that encryption in transit and encryption at rest is inadequate and not zero trust?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sanjeev. And indeed, I often encounter people that say, oh, we use encryption. And what they refer to is they use encryption in transit or they use encryption at rest, but they don't use end-to-end encryption. So they don't really, there's not really that effective. And here's why. Encryption in transit protects you from the user to the server, but then the data is decrypted at the server. Encryption at rest protects you when you have the data in storage, just waiting there, but not when it's processed, not when an email is loaded into the server, prepared to be sent over and whatnot. It's just when it's staying there untouched, unused. It's meant to protect an attacker who breaks into the data center, steals the disk and runs away, which is not an attack that happens a ton anymore. The problem is in the server during the processing, those emails, those files, that data, the database is unencrypted. It's unencrypted, it's accessible. So if the attacker breaks in, they get access to the data. That's why it's very important to have end-to-end encryption, because end-to-end encryption keeps the data encrypted. Even then, it's encrypted from the very beginning at the user and only decrypted at the other user. So it covers encryption in transit, it covers encryption at the server in use, and also covers encryption at rest. It's the whole end-to-end encryption. So when somebody says, I use encryption, you have to ask what kind of, in what way, right? Because you can use it in transit and storage at rest, but then it's not going to be enough. You should use it in use as well. That's why end-to-end encryption is very powerful, because it covers the whole end-to-end.
Thanks, Raluca. Here's another question that is often asked. Well, I am implementing encryption and the solution is relying on a key server. The key server generates a key. I get to have user keys. I encrypt my information, and therefore the cloud can't see it, and therefore the information is secure. Tell us why. What's the fallacy in relying on key servers, and why they don't represent, again, a zero trust system?
Yeah, very good question. I definitely hear that scenario often where some company says, well, I offer end-to-end encryption and I have a key server, and the two of them don't go together. So basically, the problem with the key server is that even though your data is encrypted to the server, if you have a key server at the server where the key lies, well, the attacker is going to steal the encrypted file and the key and decrypt it. So even though it's encrypted, if the key is available at the server on the key server, then the attacker can get the key, can get the encrypted file and decrypt it. So that is not end-to-end encryption. End-to-end encryption is only when you have the keys at the two ends, and only then you have this protection of end-to-end lack of visibility. Right, the moment you have the key available at the server, even if it's against more software walls and whatnot, the attacker can still break in, get the key, get the encrypted data, and then decrypt it. So in that sense, having a key server violates end-to-end encryption. Now, why is it that some companies are doing that? Why is it that they have a key server when it violates end-to-end encryption? It's because it's hard to provide an easy-to-use solution with pure end-to-end encryption. It's hard. I mean, we had to come up with new research. We had to come up with new technology, with patents, with new techniques to make it as easy to use end-to-end encryption as a regular system. But before that, it wasn't clear how to do it. So people would cop out and compromise and have a key server, but that's not end-to-end encryption. That exposes the data because the attacker can steal the data and the key.
Thank you, Raluca. I have a couple more questions. One that I'll pose, and then two questions that are in the chat. So clearly, end-to-end encryption has the benefits that you articulated, but oftentimes, both for security and compliance, you want the device to have a certain level of protection. Even with end-to-end encryption, the information is decrypted at the device, and therefore, if an attack is mounted on the device, the information is protected, is revealed. So, one of the state-of-the-art techniques that has been mentioned is the next generation advanced antivirus programs. Could you share with the audience a little bit more about what is the basis of these next generation antivirus systems? And why are they recommended as best practices to secure data?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So exactly as Sanjeev says, if you have the key on the user, you're also going to be able to decrypt the email on the user, so the user can see the email, right? The data is going to be accessible on the user side. Now, before I say how to protect the client, I want to still point out the fact that there's still a lot of progress in this layout. Why? Because the server used to be a juicy target where you have everybody's files in accessible form, right? Without end-to-end encryption, everybody's files will be accessible in unencrypted form. So if an attacker goes after the server, they get access to all those millions of records. Now, if the attacker goes after a client with end-to-end encryption, they only get that client's data. So it's much, 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 much less data. So you've already made a ton of progress by having end-to-end encryption. But now you can ask the second step that Sanjeev is saying is, okay, on the client side, how can I make sure that I reduce my exposure to attacks? And the problem is, okay, so then you have to think what kind of issues can happen on the client side. Definitely malware, viruses, downloading rogue software that can try to exfiltrate data or keys are a huge concern. That's why you always want to have an up-to-date antivirus software, malware detection. You always want to have your software being patched frequently, as soon as the patches are released, ideally, so that there's constant monitoring of what software runs on your device and avoids as much as possible this kind of rogue software. The other mechanisms actually that exist right now on the client, and they're being deployed more and more, is a so-called notion of trusted enclaves. There's going to be some hardware on your device that's going to keep your keys safe. And malware can't get in there, viruses can't get in there, but you can still use them to decrypt your files and access your data. So that's another advance that's being used more and more, and that protects the client from the key being stolen.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are out of time. I apologize, but I made a technical mistake in answering questions from Mr. Pingaro and Mr. McLaughlin. I have your questions. I was thinking that I'm typing the answer, but I inadvertently said I'd answer live.
I would love to answer them.
I don't think we have time, but what I would suggest is Mr. Pingaro and Mr. McLaughlin, shoot me the question at Sanjeev, SANJEEV, at preveil.com, and I'd be happy to answer those questions. I want to thank you, Raluca, for sharing your insights. and for bringing us up to speed on what is state-of-the-art in security for endpoints and communication systems.
Sure.
So with that, we draw a conclusion to the formal program. I'll hand it over to Orly to kick off the final sessions with our partners. Thanks, Raluca.
Thank you, everyone. And please send me the questions to me as well. They're really good questions, actually. I'm looking forward to answer them.
Yeah.
Raluca, why don't you give everyone your email so that they can reach out to you?
It's simple. It's raluca@preveil.com. And yeah, those are really good questions. So please shoot me an email. Would love to answer them. Fun question.
Thank you so much, Raluca.